So thank you so much for joining today and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nicole Weber. I'm a Senior Specialist for Capacity Strengthening and Learning with ProWash. This webinar is being jointly organized by ProWash, KELP, and the Global Wash Cluster. It is being offered in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic with many partners who will be sharing their experiences during the different webinars. This is really an introduction, an opportunity for us to learn from ongoing market-based programming work in emergency wash and to think together of how to adapt as we face new challenges with COVID-19. We won't be able to get into all the details around the how-to of market-based programming, but we really see this as a first step. And we would like to hear from you in the chat box of what else you would like to see from us on this topic. Your questions and challenges that you share today will also help us plan future webinars and additional support on this topic. We are really looking forward to today's program, and I can share now the poll results and see that about half of you in the room are already familiar with market-based programming for emergency wash, and a little over half of you are not at all and really interested in learning more. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn, KELP's Regional Representative for Americas, who will introduce today's program and speakers.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So if we could go over to the next slide, I'll just briefly introduce the agenda. So today we have about 75 minutes in total. We expect to go on time. We'll start first with an introduction to market-based programming and emergency wash, a kind of mini training from Jean-Christophe and Dana. And then this will be followed by a couple presentations of concrete examples of wash as part of the basic needs package in Jordan, which will be presented by Elizabeth and Roelof from UNHCR Jordan, followed by another example of market analysis in Zimbabwe from Parvin and Gala from Oxfam. We'll then have some time for questions and discussion and some closing remarks. But before we begin, as we said, we'll keep this to 75 minutes. If you have any questions, please insert that in the Q&A box, and that will go to the speakers. And if you have experiences that you want to share, feel free to put them in the chat box, and those can be shared more widely. Again, just please remember, please mute your mics. And a recording of the webinar and the presentations will be shared after this is all completed. So don't worry about missing some of those presentations. Great, and with that, we'll take it over to the introduction to market-based programming. Over to you, Dana.
Thank you, Lynn, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody. I have the difficult task to open this webinar and keep your interest for markets and market-based programming alive. So without further ado, we'll go straight into the presentation, and I'm waiting for the first slide to show up. Yes. Okay, so you see here in this slide two beautiful pictures, and unfortunately we do not have time for a discussion together on those two pictures, but I am telling you both pictures represent markets, and we'll spend the next couple of minutes exploring the concept of market and explaining how these two pictures are markets and how everything, basically what you see in the two pictures, are market actors in some way or belong somehow to the market. So very briefly, what is a market? Well, KELP has a definition of the market, which refers to a system of exchange between two or more actors or players. The exchange can be for goods or services or for money and can take in a physical space or through virtual media such as the internet. And markets are usually defined by forces of supply and demand rather than geographical location. So, for example, in the pictures that you see, in the first picture, we can see somehow both supply and demand represented. We see the brick manufacturer and seller, and we see also the client who is buying the bricks. So to a very limited extent, in that place in time, they represent supply and demand. Of course, supply and demand are terms that are much broader than what we see in these pictures, yeah? Because usually when we say market, we understand it as a market system, not to be confused with a marketplace. A marketplace is where the exchanges happen. A market system is something much, much bigger. So, of course, marketplaces are a common starting point to assess the potential to fulfill demand for many consumable in wash, for example, for water, for bricks for latrines, for example, or soap or other hygiene items. Yes. So in this market system, we also have what we call wash market actors. Yeah, we have the private sectors, the producers, for example, the soap producer, the wholesalers, the logistic actors, the retailers. Then we have in wash a lot of public institutions and infrastructures, such as urban water utilities, ministries, state-owned water supply and wastewater companies, and also community-based organizations like water committees or water users associations. And all these actors are linked together by market chains that can be supply chains or value chains. That's a very important part of the market, the supply chain. All actors from producers to consumers going through wholesalers and retailers form a central part of the market. But then a market, it's not only the supply chain. Market also include the wash market regulations and policies, like the water norms, the national water quality standards, the national sanitation policy, the regulation of water tariffs. And still, that is not all. We also have what we call secondary markets and infrastructure, such as supply chains of chemicals for water treatment plants, plastic market for jerry cans, logistic companies, roads, energy production companies. So a lot of actors. Right, so this is in a very brief description what are the key elements of wash markets. Remember, especially the supply chain, the regulations, and the secondary market and infrastructure. So in the end, when we say market-based programming, what exactly do we mean? And we have here the marketing crisis and CALP definition. Everybody can read it on the screen. I will also read it myself. Market-based programming covers all types of engagement with market systems, ranging from actions that deliver immediate relief to those that proactively strengthen and catalyze local market systems or market hubs. I must admit, it is quite abstract. So next, we are going to see a few examples of what this means. At the very minimum, we want to be market sensitive, meaning that through the interventions we implement, even if they are classic WASH interventions, we have to be careful not to harm the market. For that purpose, we need to do WASH market assessments, also to conduct a proper analysis, leading us at the proper conclusions whether market-based modalities are appropriate or not in our context. And we need to monitor the market. So this is at the very minimum in whatever kind of WASH programming. Then second, we can use local markets. If markets function sufficiently well, and we find what we need on the local market without disturbing the market, creating distortions, then we can do local procurement for WASH items to distribute to people affected by humanitarian emergencies. We can do value vouchers, commodity vouchers, any kind of vouchers like water, soap, hygiene item vouchers. Or we can do simply cash transfers. Of course, considerations about using vouchers and cash are multiple. And one important rule is to remember that that vouchers are sometimes more appropriate when markets are not so strong. Going next, we can also strengthen markets if they are not sufficiently functional. And this is where all the rest of the market-based programming comes in. We can help WASH local businesses to restart or to become stronger. We can also support WASH public and private services. For instance, we can, going back to the local businesses, we can support local businesses to restock after an emergency or to get bigger stock, something that they don't usually get. And last, we can develop the markets. This is not so usual in emergencies, but it's has been done in the WASH sector for years in development context. In that case, we can develop new WASH products, services, and supply chains. Okay, in the end, why do we do market-based programming? Well, for a multitude of reasons, and I think I already mentioned, first of all, in order not to harm the markets. And then, because in this way we respond better to the needs of the beneficiaries. Like, for instance, look at the lady in this picture. She seems to be very happy to have received the cash. The question is, what will she use it for? Will she use it for WASH goods and services? Well, we are not so sure. If her buying habits are not such that she is used to buy WASH goods and services, that maybe she will not. Again, maybe she has those habits, or at least she buys certain WASH goods and services, perhaps like soap and other hygiene items. Then, of course, it depends also what her priorities are. If and that also depends on the amount of money she received. Is the amount of money sufficient so that she can prioritize well? Well, from the picture we don't know, but let's hope that she does. And she can also prioritize wash items. Okay, so next, market-based programming and especially cash and vouchers are considered to be a more efficient and effective delivery modality. There have been multiple studies, not necessarily in the wash sector, but in general, which have shown this. Of course, there are many nuances in this, but overall, it is a more efficient means of delivery. And then, very importantly, by supporting and working with markets, we can boost economic recovery, and we can help everybody make a living. Yeah, because markets are not there only for people to buy things, but some of them have businesses and whole families live from these businesses. So working with markets helps the economy to continue functioning, which, for instance, in the current COVID context is very important. And in this way, by being continuously used and supported, wash markets become more resilient and more autonomous in their functioning. So again, very quickly, only that we have everybody on the same page. We'll look now at the cash and voucher assistance definition. And remember, cash and voucher assistance is the preferred term these days, but you'll hear many other terms which are equivalent, such as cash transfer programming or cash-based assistance, cash-based intervention, and so on, depending on the agency. So again, the CALP definition says that CVA are all programs where cash transfers or vouchers for goods or services are directly provided to individuals, households, or community recipients, not to governments or other state actors. And we will go very briefly also through some key terminology, which many of you may know, but again, we want everybody on the same page. So depending on the actions which recipients need to do in order to receive the cash assistance, we have unconditional CVA, for which beneficiaries don't need to do anything in order to receive them, except fulfill the targeting criteria. And we have conditional cash assistance. And in the wash sector, you have the cash for work, for which beneficiaries need to work in order to receive it. And we also have the installments that the wash sector typically does for the construction of latrines, and beneficiaries receive the second installment only if they use the first one as they were told to start the construction of their latrine. Then, depending on the use that people can make of the received cash, cash transfers can be typically unrestricted, and usually all cash is unrestricted. And then we have the restricted modalities, which nowadays we agree that refers only to vouchers. And going further, this determines, as I already said, the modality. So the unrestricted cash transfers and the restricted vouchers or in-kind assistance or service delivery. With two types of vouchers, commodity vouchers and value vouchers. commodity vouchers being vouchers for a certain quantity of goods or services, value vouchers like $10 to be exchanged against any wash goods. And all this that can be delivered either like cash in hand or e-cash, or paper vouchers or e-vouchers. Nowadays, we have more and more the e-cash and the e-vouchers taking over. This can be a bit expensive to set up, but once the program starts and it has multiple rounds of distribution, they can be much more efficient than cash in hand and paper vouchers. And to close my presentation, I will just go very quickly through a few examples of cash assistance in the WASH sector. For example, WASH-specific vouchers. I think you are all very familiar with WASH-specific vouchers for water, for hygiene items, for dislodging, and so on. Then you have multi-sector vouchers, including WASH. They can be for multiple items like food, NFIs, hygiene, and so on. Then we have the labeled cash for WASH, although actually it's not very much used in the WASH sector. Labeled means that the use of cash is not restricted because it's cash, so we don't have a control over the expenditures people make, but we can communicate very strongly that the cash is given for WASH, for water, for the latrine reconstruction, and so on. That is what we call labeled. Then we have the typical conditional cash for WASH, which you use usually for latrine construction in installments, or the cash for work. And here I will stop to explain a bit that cash for work in WASH is used to complete certain WASH infrastructure work, right? And that's where the primary WASH objective is. You can build community latrines using this type of projects, or wash water pipelines and so on. But the cash that is given to people is really not restricted or labeled, and people can use it as they want. So yes, the program overall has a WASH objective, but not the cash in it so much. And then very importantly and trending these days, you have the multipurpose cash, which is more and more considered. And we will have a very good example in the presentations in the second part of the webinar. So I'm not developing this anymore, and handing over to Jean-Christophe.
Hi everybody. My name is Jean-Christophe Barbiche. I'm working for the Global WASH Cluster. So now we are going to explore the other side of market-based programming, which is supporting the supply side, so supporting the market. We have supported the access and help directly the beneficiary with CVA. So now we can support the market actors. So we will start by a short poll. If you would like to take a few seconds to answer to that by looking at those two pictures. The idea is to answer which market support activity do you think were necessary to achieve this result? I mean, there is two pictures. One is from an SEF program in Madagascar. Another one is Oxfam in Zimbabwe. Yeah, I think we can end the polling now and share the results. So I think you're right. I mean, these results were not didn't go by themselves. I mean, they required quite a lot of efforts from ACF and Oxfam for these two projects in terms of training of the actor, technical training, but also training in terms of marketing and business. Some maybe were provided some cash grant to start up the activity. Some were provided some material, and so on. There is no definition by CALP of market support, although some other definition will match. But the Global WASH Cluster market-based programming guidance give a definition of market support, which is intervention, which goal is to improve indirectly the situation of the crisis-affected population by providing support to market actors. The indirect nature of this modality is important because at this stage, unless it's a specific livelihood program, the people you are going to support and the actors you are going to support may not be directly affected by the crisis, and it's an important distinction to be made. So who are those market actors? Dana briefly mentioned those at the beginning. They can be vendors of hygiene items throughout the whole supply chain. So importers, wholesalers, retailers, producers even of hygiene items. We can be very various, from soap to menstrual hygiene material, jerry cans, etc. You have also the water and sanitation utilities. So the private or semi-private or governmental company who are supplying water through water networks, and then you have the public institutions who are part of the market, the ministries, the public institute, and finally the community-based organizations such as water user association or water committee, who are in poor rural areas, often the only water market actors available locally. So what can you do to support those actors? You can give some grants, some cash grant, which is often done by NGO. $500, $1,000 to start up the business, to maybe reconstruct your shop if you are a hygiene material vendor. If you are maybe a water utility, then you will need a much larger grant, which can be given by some agencies. Some new agencies has some specific, as UNICEF, has some specific modality to transfer money to utilities. And then you can donate material, which can range from spare parts to chlorine, aluminum sulfate to run your water treatment plant, etc. You can also provide subsidies. I mean, in some cases, you have seen the WASH cluster providing, for instance, a fuel voucher to water utilities, so they continue to run their pumping station or water treatment, or advocating for the suppression of tax from the government by the government to certain products which are considered life-saving, like soap, for instance, or chlorine. You can also implement skill transfer, so training basically. But also put in contact different actors at different levels. If you take water committees, for instance, who are responsible for hand pump maintenance, then they need to know where to buy the spare parts, and they need to be linked to some spare parts supplier who are often in the capital city or in large urban centers, and maybe to buy those spare parts in bulk to make them cheaper and more interesting for the supplier. You have all the secondary market aspect as well, so logistic, energy, to name a few. For water market actors, it can be complicated to organize the logistic of their product if there is insecurity, if there is difficult access because of flooding, etc. So WASH NGOs can help them in doing so. In the same way, you can advocate for maybe supply the energy producing plant locally in fuel, in coal, so the energy and the electricity will keep on running, and the water facility will be able to produce water. And finally, you can also advocate for a change in terms of policy, maybe to officialize water vendors, for instance, water kiosks, who are often informal or private. You can give them an official status of and make them part of as official market actors. Market support is often used as a barrier to, to remove, as a solution to remove availability barriers. So you try to increase the availability of sanitation material, of water, of household water treatment, of hygiene product on the market. But you can have modalities such as social marketing, who can have a positive effect on availability, but also on demand and behaviors. This is the humanitarian program cycle, roughly, with each phase. And in terms, if we speak now more in general about market-based programming, and not only about market support, I'm going to give you maybe a quick overview, because we cannot spend too much time, of what does it mean for each phase. So in terms of assessment, as Dana mentioned, market assessments are maybe the cornerstone of market-based programming. You need to assess the market, the critical market that you have identified. It can be water, it can be soap or cement, in order to find the right solution to support it. In terms of response analysis, in the wash sector, often we have skipped this part, because the emergency water, sanitation or hygiene activities that needs to be implemented are often obvious. You need to do water trucking, you need to do to construct latrines. But when you consider the market, then you have much more different modalities that you can use, also in conjunction with other sectors. So now this type of response analysis is really key to define what to do. Whether to give voucher, to support the market, to give cash, unrestricted cash, multi-sector modality, etc. And this discussion needs to happen with other sectors. In terms of resource mobilization, things can be a little bit more complicated than usual, because especially for multi-sector modality, such as multi-purpose cash, which can be used for water by beneficiary to buy water, but then the wash donor, the typical wash donor, how can they contribute to this modality, or should they even contribute to this modality when it is not sure that beneficiary will buy water with this cash, because they will go by order of priority. In terms of implementation, you have many delivery mechanisms that you can use, as Dana mentioned. And the choice of delivery mechanism, whether it's electronic voucher, whether it's cash in hand, will be conditioned by the availability of financial supplier, which can be banks, which can be private supplier, private CVA suppliers such as Red Rose, who will provide a complete key in hand system for your operation. So in terms of implementation, things can be a little bit more a little bit different than what you were used to. What will not change, however, will be the monitoring, because it's not because you are using cash or voucher that you should stop monitor the process, monitor the output and the outcome of the intervention. And it's quite the opposite. The quality control and outcome monitoring should be strengthened for market-based programming in general. In terms of evaluation and learning, I am involved in a Global Wash Cluster project, 6 months project, to collect evidence on market-based programming. So we collected more than 300 practices related to water, sanitation, and hygiene, and market. We are trying to analyze the evidence that those practices led to positive effect on water access, on sanitation use, etc. And so far, obviously the evidence are very thin, and some really important gaps are observed, especially for restricted modality, although we know that there are good evidence that people, when given cash, will use it to buy water or hygiene. The use that those people are making of water and hygiene is very seldom monitored in very rare occasion. So, and the impact of this on health even less. And finally, the preparedness is an important step, because if you are not prepared, it will be quite impossible to implement CVA or even market support intervention if you haven't done market assessment in the past. If you don't have somebody who is skilled in cash transfer among your team, it will be complicated. Okay. Now we are going to, because obviously everybody is quite interested in terms of response to the current outbreak of COVID-19, and there are some links with market-based programming. So we are going to go through some of them. First of all, talking about opportunities. Most markets in the countries where we work have been affected by the outbreak, either because market actors cannot operate as usual, or because supply chain cannot respond. You know, there are restrictions in importations, etc. So market-based programming can be seen as a great opportunity to address those challenges. Some modality, some cash transfer or voucher modality can reduce transmission risk, especially for the staff of the agency that is operating, because especially and especially for electronic modality, of course, because they can be used remotely, or at least quite a lot of things can happen remotely. There are quite a lot of opportunities in terms of partnership with the private sector, hygiene producers, communication company. We can see on the right a hand washing device that was produced by some private manufacturers in Madagascar within the ACF social marketing program. So there are quite opportunities to be found in terms of partnership with private actors. In Burundi, UNICEF is trying to make the soap cheaper by working with a private company, producing soap at national level. So how can you make this soap cheaper for consumers? Finally, the local economy and livelihood are impacted by the outbreak. So you need to work with those actors, and market support can have an impact on livelihood. And finally, we need to think about after the outbreak, because market will recover as usual, and by working with them now, we can fasten this recovery. But there is also quite a lot of risk associated to market-based programming. So first of all, markets are not functioning properly. So distributing cash and distributing voucher may not lead to what you are expected if people cannot find the items in the shop, or the services that you are trying to deliver. People may have reduced access to shops in many countries, so they cannot. You give a voucher, you give cash, but how can they access to the shop? In the same way, they will have difficult access to cash points, ATM. Stigmatization of cash assistance. When you have a refugee going to withdraw cash in Lebanon or in Jordan, the host community, for instance, might see it as really unfair for them, and you can lead to conflict between host communities and refugees. Local currency are devaluated, and for the same amount of cash in local currency, you can now buy less things that you could before if those items are imported. And you need also to consider the current beneficiary priorities, who are probably not the one that you are interested in, because they will be focused on food, they will be focused on paying their rent, and maybe not on buying soap or water. So in some case, maybe not always, but door-to-door distribution or voucher with specific date, to stagger the distribution may be preferred to distribute cash, for instance. And finally, last slides to speak about the resource. So you will have this presentation with the link, so you will be able to download those two documents who are the most recent produced by the Global WASH Cluster on cash and market. In terms of support, you have the help desk on the Global WASH Cluster website, where you can ask questions by email and receive support. Global WASH Cluster also have implemented a training scheme with face-to-face distance learning and mass webinar, which is the one we are implementing now. And soon will be shared with you a database of the 300 documents that I mentioned previously. CALP is also providing good support through e-learnings. It's quite a number of them that you can find on this link, and a dedicated page dedicated to COVID-19 resource. So thank you very much. Nicole, if you want to, the floor is yours, or Lynn.
Great, thank you, Jean-Christophe and Dana, for your presentation and whistle-stop tour on all the resources and key knowledge from the Global WASH Cluster. As we transition to the next set of speakers, we wanted to launch another poll. So here we want to find out what do you see as the most challenging part of implementing market-based programming for WASH? So just take a minute to do that. And in just a moment, we'll turn to presenters from UNHCR Jordan to discuss some of their experiences. So we have Elizabeth Barnhart, who's the Senior Cash-Based Interventions Officer, and Roelof Wenzel, the WASH Officer, both with UNHCR Jordan. Let me just give a few more seconds to the poll, and then I might just end it so that we could see what the main outcomes are. Great. And here we see the monitoring aspect was highlighted as one of the most significant challenges, but then market assessment, selection of the modality, and market monitoring are also some challenges. Great, thank you. So now I'll turn it over to Elizabeth and Roelof for their presentation.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for your introduction. We will tell something about WASH programming, cash programming in Jordan. First, I would like to give some background about Jordan, the crisis, why we're programming here, something about Jordan itself, type of country and the services, and then afterwards Elizabeth will take over from me to explain a little bit more about what we do in Jordan as UNHCR in cash and WASH. Next slide, please. So what you will all see in the first picture is the number of refugees, Syrian refugees. You can see that the number of refugees in Jordan has been stable since a number of years, which means that we have had time to develop our programming as UNHCR, but also other actors in Jordan. So it's not an emergency anymore, it's a protected crisis with quite a stable population. And the situation at the moment in Syria is not progressing in such a way that people are able or willing to return. Next picture, please. Here you can see Jordan. You can see that most people stay in the northern part of Jordan, close to the Syrian Republic. It's not the main reason they stay there, it's because there's economic opportunities over there. And the remaining part of Jordan is quite like a desert, so there's not that much economic activities and things to do. So that's why they stay there, and that's also makes that the pressure on the current economic system and the society in those areas is quite high. Next slide, please. If you look at the population of Jordan, it's around 10 million at the moment. There are more or less 1.3 Syrians. More or less half of them is registered here. Jordan is considered an upper middle income country, which means that almost every service is available in Jordan at quite a high level. Jordan in itself is not economically not doing very well. We have a very high debt at the moment. Almost no natural resources, almost no surface water. There's a lot of water in the ground, but it's also, we're depleting it very fast. And if you look at WASH, it's very impressive. Jordan households, 94% of them has access to safe water, mostly through a municipal network. And most of the households also have access to safely managed sanitation. That's about Jordan as a background and the context in which, as UNHCR, we're trying to serve refugees. Jordan received refugees from 2011. There are two main big refugee camps for Syrians. There are also other refugees from other origins, but we're mainly, the main big chunk of refugees is originating from Syria. We have two main big refugee camps, and we will see pictures later on. But one of them, which was set up as a transit camp, is Zaatari. There's more or less 80,000 people at the moment. In peak times, there were 140,000, but since then, since Azraq has opened some years later, there's now 80,000. In Azraq, there's 40,000. Zaatari is closely located to some cities, agricultural areas around, all kinds of services and markets around, while Azraq is located in the desert, completely built before refugees arrived, very well organized, but also very restricted in movements because it's far away from any nearby city. I think the nearby city is 25 kilometers away. Hard to get there, hard to get out, limited permits to leave. Very different, and also a big impact on how UNHCR and other partners are able to program there. But because we have like more or less 650,000 registered refugees within Jordan, that means that that most of the refugees live outside the refugee camps in urban areas, and they use the services which are available for Jordanians. Next slide, please. And then if you look to the kind of services which are provided in camps, and the camps are managed by both UNHCR together with the Jordanian government. UNHCR is managing those camps. We are making sure that all services are being provided to refugees, and all services are provided for free. UNICEF is providing the wash services, water from boreholes. In Zaatari, every household has a private storage tank and a private connection where water is delivered every week or every 5 or 6 days. While in Azraq, it's water taps, all for free. Every refugee gets a standard amount of 35 liters per day. Every refugee has also access to a latrine, sometimes shared, sometimes a private latrine, and all wastewater is treated, which is considered to be quite a high level, we think. Since the beginning of the crisis, there was hygiene promotion, but because it's such an extended crisis, all hygiene promotion has been adjusted to such an extent where it's only used when needed. At the moment with COVID, it's being used a lot to send out hygiene messages, and that's, Syrian refugees were fed up with all these people knocking on the door about hygiene. And then the last thing about wash services in camps, we have been providing in-kind distribution, but we fully monetized it. On the next page, we'll come to that in a minute. You can see the difference between camps and why it was also very different in setting up, changing this from in-kind to monetized. If you look at wash services out of camp, refugees who live there, they have to pay for every service like every other Jordanian living in Jordan. And if you look at the WASH actors in Jordan, the biggest chunk of the humanitarian budget or development budget is going to infrastructure and preparation for the future. So in water conservation projects, climate resilient activities. But at the moment, there's no WASH actors implementing cash for WASH. And Elizabeth, my colleague, will tell you a little bit more about it later, but that's I think that's important to know how integrated support of any sector into the cash program in Jordan is. Next slide, please. What you can see, this is Azraq, built in 2014, very well organized. You can see the different shelters in groups of 12 with communal wash blocks. Every plot has 12 shelters and 4 wash blocks. Very organized, and it also means that the markets are very organized, but far away from any local market, and it's a controlled market as well. While the other picture you can see there from Zatri Camp Market, it's a picture in the evening, there's lights, there's a lot of people, you can buy whatever you want, almost. It's a fully functional market there, and it's a good regular economy over there. This is what I wanted to say about the Syria crisis and how it impacts Jordan and in which context refugees are being hosted by Jordan. That's it for my part. Over to Elizabeth, who will explain a little bit more about cash programming in Jordan.
Thanks, Roland. All right, if we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a bit about the urban environment now, moving you into the urban. And as Roland mentioned, more than 80% live in cities and towns, and that's more than 500,000 Syrians plus another 100,000 or so refugees from other countries like Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Eritrea, etc. Jordan has a very strong marketplace economy, as you saw even from the refugee camp in Zatri. On February 14th, if you walk down that marketplace, you will see nothing but red for Valentine's Day. That's how strong the market-driven economy is here. And that's largely true of most of the MENA countries. Syrian refugees have been in country here now for 9 years, and others like Iraqis and Sudanese and Somalis have been here even longer. And the longer they stay in country, the more they experience a loss of assets, including productive assets, in order to make their needs met each month. They have insufficient income from work opportunities. They move quickly into debt. So how do we best serve a displaced population? And first, of course, we as UNHCR always want to look at protection concerns. And so those 3 just general items that I have bulleted there, the knowing your population and the environment, because our first mandate is do no harm. Secondly, of course, we want to support the most fragile in the population because we don't have enough money to do blanket distribution. And we're very, very mindful of creating dependencies. So we do take a basic needs approach, and that is looking at what are the survival needs for refugees, displaced persons in the population, and those we identify as rent, food, utilities, water, and sanitation. And that's considered the survival expenditure basket package, or the basic needs package. This package provides protection to families. It reduces the risk of exploitation and abuse, including exploitative work, early marriage, which is a problem here, removing children from school for labor or other purposes, childcare, etc., or to remove the costs of going to school from the family budget. But it's also providing security for the nation, for the host country, by making refugees a contributing factor to the local economy, not just a burden. And this is part of our social inclusion, social cohesion approach to refugees living in communities. The problems that we see with in-kind distribution is that people need cash and they need to make their own decisions on the priorities that they have for their families. And this creates a black market of goods. So the moment we see donors giving stuff, such as jackets during winter or other types of products during specific needs periods of time, like right now soap, immediately you'll see all of these goods on the marketplace. This undercuts and undersells the local shop owners who are right down the street, and this does not promote good relationships between the two. Next slide, please. We are blessed in Jordan by the ability to collect an enormous amount of data. So following registration, where every asylum seeker first comes into UNHCR, one of our many registration centers throughout the country, and registers as a person of concern or an asylum seeker, we follow that up with a home visit. And during that home visit, we collect a wealth of information that looks at vulnerabilities throughout a variety of sectors. And those sectors you can see here: basic needs, education, food security, health, shelter, and WASH. We also create the universal indicators that are very well known. We have a predicted welfare or a poverty score. We have documentation status as an indicator, coping strategies through the Livelihoods Coping Strategies Index and Reduced Coping Strategies Index, and dependency ratio. We also have a child labor indicator that's just been added this year. Now, the beauty of the VAF, this is under what we call the Vulnerability Assessment Framework, the VAF. It's a countrywide platform, and we have common and agreed upon elements. And we've got 50 organizations that use this data that include the use of a common questionnaire. Each of these sectors define the indicators and the scoring. So this is a collaborative approach. We do a biannual population survey, and then we do the targeted home visits on those people who are requesting assistance. We have a data platform. So all of this data is shared with all of the humanitarian partnership throughout the country. They can go on and see family by family what their scoring is for each of these elements, these 65 indicators. And then we have an advisory board that defines and manages it all. And that's made up of 4 UN agencies, 4 INGOs, and 2 donors. So as you can see, it's a very incredibly strong and robust way for us to continue to assess the population year to year. UNHCR alone does about 50,000 home visit assessments every year. If you can go to the next slide, please. This allows us to target who we feel is most eligible. And these are just a few of the 65 indicators that I noted on the previous slide. And in the basic needs area, we use debt per capita and expenditure as part of our eligibility criteria, along with coping strategies, dependency ratios. And I wanted to show you also what the WASH indicators look like. We have 12 different WASH indicators that are collected during this home visit assessment. All of these indicators, these 65 indicators, are ranked from low to severe, which gives us an understanding when we create a scoring criteria. We collect the elements that we feel are most appropriate for our type of program, and then create that list according to that eligibility scoring and criteria. Next, please. So let me propose the idea that there is no such thing as multipurpose cash. And I say that because cash is only a modality, it's not a program. And every program that you have has a programmatic objective. It has outcomes, indicators, and impact that sit behind that program. And when you look at using cash for any type of program, you've got to measure who you're assisting, how you're assisting, and what the impact is for that beneficiary population. So in Jordan, we use cash for all of these programs. So between our 50 partners using cash as a modality for assistance, we have every single one of these types being done. The type that I'm talking about today, of course, is the basic needs, which incorporates parts of food security, in other words, the humanitarian food package part, along with rent, utilities, and water and sanitation. So all of these elements are incorporated into what we consider to be a multi-sectoral use of cash assistance. Next slide, please. How much to give? We use the annual minimum expenditure basket that is conducted by all the sectors in country to get a pricing, an annual pricing. And this is the 2019 MEB. The 2020 was set to be done in April, and as you can imagine, that's been delayed a bit due to COVID. But our basic needs package, as I mentioned, are those elements that are in blue. So they look at rent by family size, utilities, food, water, sanitation. Those are the elements of a basic needs package. And each of those elements is looked at, the costing for that is by family size. We cap at 7. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at the impacts for a basic needs approach, again, we can't say what impact it might have on SGBV, or what impact it might have on education, or what impact it might have on health, because we're not looking specifically at that. Our programmatic objectives are to ensure that people have the survival needs. So what are we looking for? We are looking to see that people have more stable accommodation, and in fact, we do find that that is true. We have stronger food consumption scores. We find that the debt ratio is lower for those who receive basic needs assistance. It does have an impact on educational opportunities because families don't have to deprioritize the costs of transportation and school supplies for their children. There's a reduction in the Livelihoods Coping Strategies Index. And so these are some of the elements that we look at when we do post-distribution monitoring. Next slide, please. I think that this one sort of identifies just in general why we think it's most important to look first always at cash as a modality when it is fit for purpose. And there are lots of ways that you need to address due diligence for using cash. But when cash is appropriate, it's the right choice. Why? It gives freedom of choice. There's a dignity in it for the person of concern. And I hear, especially from my own country, often the question, well, how do you know they're using it for the right reason? When you are in a position of needing to prioritize your family needs, we don't need foreign organizations telling us how to use our money. I think the best story I ever heard of this was from someone who worked with WFP, who came out on a consultancy, who was a Katrina victim. And that was the hurricane that happened in the United States, when people tried to give her things, but she had no home left to put the things in. And so what we want to do is ensure that people have choice in how they spend their money based upon the needs that they identify for themselves and their children. We know that cash has a multiplier effect in the economy. And as I mentioned, we really do look at social inclusion and social cohesion as elements of this. For every dollar that we give, there's a multiplier effect in the local economy. Cash is much more fraud-proof, frankly. It's easier to reconcile, it's more transparent and more accountable for all intents and purposes. We also know that it is more efficient and effective in terms of cost and delivery, and fewer issues in terms of leakage and duplication. We can manage deduplication amongst all of our 50 organizations doing cash through a coordination platform that we manage. It also allows refugees who have been taken away from their normal livelihoods and their normal institutional frameworks to have some level of financial inclusion. And this can be managed in a variety of ways, but it does allow them to manage and budget their own money. And when we can get into financially inclusive options like mobile wallets, where they own the account themselves, we can talk about a real step into financial inclusion, far from full financial inclusion, however. And I think that all of this has been supported by a number of studies by development actors as well as humanitarian actors in Rwanda, Uganda, and Lebanon. And that's just the beginning of what we're starting to see as real evidence behind the use of cash. I mentioned, next slide, please, that deduplication is an important element in what we do. We have what's called a cash and voucher dashboard that's automatically updated from that coordination platform I mentioned. And if you take a look at the all of the organizations, the organization summary, these are all of our cash actors in Jordan. And you can see the cumulative amount dispersed last year was 240 million. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see why the cash was provided, whether it was for basic needs, food security, education. And this is a live dashboard, and I can send the link out. But if you click on these, it will give you information about which type of refugee from what country, the country of origin, as you can see down below, or where in the country this cash was distributed, as well as by month. So this is just one of the ways that we do tracking of who is giving what to whom in order to deduplicate. Because for every duplication, when a family receives cash assistance from more than one organization, that means another family goes without. down to the last slide. And I hope I've gotten you back on time here. I want to say thank you very much, and we've added some of our basic information for you to follow up on if you're interested, and then there's a contact email in case there are questions.
Thank you so much to both of you for your presentation. It's a really interesting topic, and I've seen a lot of questions come into the Q&A. And so as we move on to the next presenter, they'll be answering your questions, and you can always see the response in the answered section. So next we'll move to our last presentation, and I do want to apologize ahead of time. We are going to be going over on time a little bit, but I do hope everyone will be able to stay for this interesting presentation from Zimbabwe. So I'd like to introduce Parvin Ngala, who is Head of Programs for East and Central Africa at Oxfam. And so thank you so much, Parvin. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just try and go through the bigger things, mostly because from the presentations before, I think we've captured the key essence of what we mean by market-based programming. What's unique, I guess, in this context is mostly that we are talking about non-camp situations, and what I guess a bit of it linking to what we are seeing in the current COVID response with regards to working in informal settlements or high-density settlements, depending on what different people call them. So I'm presenting what Oxfam did work on 2 years ago in Zimbabwe, and a bit of context in terms of Zimbabwe being quite challenged when it comes to disease outbreaks. As recently as last year, they had a major cholera outbreak. They have recurring typhoid outbreaks. So what the program that we were involved in was specifically looking at how we can work with local markets, especially in line with the Grand Bargain commitments on strengthening the ability of local markets to meet different sector needs of crisis affected populations. So what I'll be speaking to is about pre-crisis market analysis. A couple of you from the chat boxes I've been asking about what market assessment, what are the market assessment tools. So this is one of the approaches that was utilized, and in this case, pre-crisis, meaning it is conducted during non-crisis periods to help agencies improve preparedness and planning, especially to design disaster risk reduction programs. So what we did in Zimbabwe was looking at we noticed that there was a certain pattern with regards to the disease outbreaks, So the idea was to then see when is it that we are in non-crisis mode and how can we prepare for crisis mode. So the timing of what we'll call PCMA was aimed to provide readiness for the next crisis. So we had a reflection with sector actors who've been involved, UN agencies, local organizations, to try and see what are some of the things we see as the gaps with regards to disease outbreak responses. The other thing was to do household surveys. One of the things we had noticed was that the disease outbreaks tended to happen mostly in informal settlements or high density settlements. And so we worked together with MSF to map, areas that we could then look at what are the socioeconomic profiles, how are the wash systems and the exposure or the risk levels to disease. We did mapping with on GIS and looked after that on investigating what the market opportunities for the waterborne disease crisis are. One of the things I've mentioned also in the Q&A in responding to some of the questions is we then look at what are the critical goods, what are the critical services that we want to focus on. As an example, I think was mentioned earlier, is it about water? Is it water that we need in this location? Is it about access to household water treatment chemicals? So that was part of what we were assessing, and also prices. This is something that I've seen also in the chat box. And how does all this information help us with our contingency planning and, of course, eventually with the response? So on my next slide, what I'm sharing looks at what we saw from Zimbabwe, and in this case, Harare, in those specific high density areas. We saw that there is a centralized municipal water supply system, but the coverage is limited, you know. There was a big focus on use of boreholes and shallow wells. People were not willing to pay for water, so they tended to use shallow wells, which they had dug up themselves. And this often, these water systems were contaminated. And especially because similarly, next or in close proximity to the water shallow wells were people were digging latrines, which were supposed to be serving those households, and they were contaminating the water. So, and then in terms of hygiene market, when you talk about, we decided to focus on household water treatment chemicals. We did find that people knew about the use of hygiene products, but they were not necessarily buying them, and the items were not even available on the local market. And that being the case, there was no fluctuation, for instance, in terms of demand or supply. And this was linked mostly to who supplies, you know, how do they have access to these products? And more often than not, the NFIs, the hygiene products, were distributed freely during outbreaks. Dana mentioned earlier, I think Elizabeth also mentioned, in terms of the impact of free supply of some of these chemicals. And I mentioned this especially because during this COVID pandemic, I know many of us are involved in forms of intervention that are looking at free supply of this material. So just for you to have a reflection on that as we go forward. So looking at the situation.
Parvin, can I ask you, sorry, Parvin, can you put your presentation in full screen presenter mode?
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
From current slide. Please tell me if you can see it. Okay. Yeah, thanks. So, so what we did do was comparing what's the difference during non-crisis period and what do we see, the crisis period being mostly the rainy season. The rainy season is when water availability increases, which means many of the people are using the shallow wells, the boreholes, but it's also during the period where there's a lot of burst sewers and water pipes because of the high pressure, which then puts a situation where there is contamination of the water systems. There's no dislodging before the rains, there's poor waste management, but noticing that there's no difference in terms of people being able to have water treatment chemicals available in the shops. And that in itself means that the focus was on water treatment, but mostly on the basis of supply from NGOs and the UN agencies. Now, we did an analysis and try to decide, okay, what becomes a priority work that we do? You know, the modalities, the focus areas. So from the market assessment, we then looked at different things. Could we focus on household water treatment? Do we need to focus on hygiene promotion? Do we need to look at water quality monitoring? Or do we look at contingency planning? So for our intervention, informed by the findings from this pre-crisis market assessment, we felt that the most important area to look at was on household water treatment. Yes, hygiene promotion, for most of us who are WASH programmers, we know that hygiene promotion has to be a part of our programs. It's part of what was mentioned earlier in terms of demand, social marketing, but household water treatment was where we were leveraging a lot of the work that we were doing. So what's available up there is just showing a process in terms of how we went to decide which are the priority actions that we then focus on. And this was based on looking at one, the demand. The demand for water, household water treatment in the communities was based on perceptions around dislike for water, for the smell of the product, or access to free products, especially during outbreaks, belief that boreholes, I remember, of course, in my first days, whenever we talked about boreholes, most of us assume boreholes provide safe water, yeah? So there was a belief that we needed to also support in addressing price perception. For many people, by virtue of the fact that these products were supplied by agencies, there was a perception that the price was too high. I can't afford to buy it anyway, so I'm only going to wait until the outbreak happens or until we get these items available. When you looked at the supply element, local traders were not stocking these items. There were local companies that could have manufacture the household water treatment chemicals, but we were not looking to them. What we were doing as UN agencies, as NGOs, is we get in our water treatment chemicals and supply them to the communities. And what this did was that it created what I call a negative cycle. People don't treat their water until there is a disease outbreak. And because during the disease outbreak, people will rely on the free treatment, people never buy water treatment chemicals, or they don't see the importance of buying it because they rely on it. So it perpetuates a cycle that you don't treat your water, the disease outbreak happens, and then you only use the free water supply, free water treatment chemicals. So part of our program was then looking at how can we encourage buying, utilization of household water treatment chemical so as not to get to that point where we have disease outbreaks. And so what we did as part of our programs, we we rolled out 2 cash and voucher programs. One was looking at a short-term response where we provided water treatment chemicals, but this was in the form of a voucher. Go to the shop with this voucher and you can be able to get the water treatment chemicals. The picture that Jean-Christophe shared earlier was making sure that we're working with the traders in terms of availing those the water treatment chemicals. And then the other part was the suppliers were actually local. You know, the manufacturing company was actually local. So the thing was to be able to establish the linkages between manufacturers, retailers, and communities in terms of where can we get these chemicals when we need them. The other part of it was a sort of social marketing program. We had a buy one, get one free program, just to encourage for those who are not necessarily benefiting from the voucher program, which was focused on the areas where there were outbreaks. But for those areas which were high risk but had no cases of cholera, we then looked at having a promotional program where it was supposed to stimulate, go buy one, it is available, and going forward, this is something that you can be able to utilize. So that was what we did with that program. And Dana mentioned earlier about different things that we can do in terms of market-based programming. If you're working, you know, at policy level, what is it that we need to do with regards to changes on our contingency plans, how they work in terms of water quality monitoring, looking at who we're working with in terms of facilitating partnerships between manufacturers, wholesalers, traders, to ensure there is distribution of this necessary critical goods and services, how we transition, you know, if, our program. Somebody asked earlier about, in the Q&A, about can we only use one modality with the response? No, you can change, you know, there can be a point where you're doing direct distribution, but as you go along, as you do assessments to get to know the markets locally, you can transition between different ways of delivering. And also working with the sector actors on looking at the implications of the type of interventions that we set up. So, and finally, how can we apply the learning to COVID-19? Emphasizing the market assessments, you know, as in, are we checking even before, you know, I think the other day, some of you might already be privy to this, there's a lot of push for, do we have hand washing stations? Where can we get these hand washing stations? Do we need to import them? Look at what is available locally. When you're talking about soap, look at what is available locally. What are the prices? Is it an issue of affordability in the community? Is it an issue of where are the items? Is it distance? And that's where then you're looking at what are the modalities? Where should I invest in my programs? Looking at how our interventions impact community resilience. Elizabeth mentioned this. When you talk about distributing water treatment chemicals, we need to be careful in terms of, if you're doing something free, are you doing harm to the local market by virtue of the fact that you're creating expectations, you're creating dependency, which overall impacts the way we deal with diseases and the hygiene or health-seeking behaviors. Monitoring and evaluation, this has been spoken to in terms of determining the impact, not just, you know, many of us like saying we distributed 100 water treatment chemicals, or they reached 100 people. But the question is, did it achieve the outcomes that we want to consider? Are people adopting the hygiene practices that are important? So going beyond outputs to the outcome level, continuity of investment. Right now, if there's anything that's coming out of COVID, it's that it's not just about now, it's about the long term. We need to be looking at what are our recovery, what are our strengthening systems as we work with markets, but also as we are doing today, working to build the capacity of WASH practitioners. Cash and voucher programming, market-based programming is not just about livelihood, it's about these other crises that rely on local systems to be able to create resilience. Thank you. And I've shared and will also share some of the reports, some of the tools that are available from Oxfam. Thank you, team.
Great. Thank you so much, Parvin. And there's a number of questions that came in to you during your presentation in the question and answer box. So if you can just go ahead and answer those. Before we close, we'd just like to ask one question to all of the panelists and maybe have some short answers around what is one or two priorities for WASH, markets, and cash and voucher assistant practitioners to consider in face of the COVID-19 pandemic. So maybe we can start with Jean-Christophe and Dana.
In terms of priority for the COVID pandemic, I think we should look at the supply chain of the product that we are interested in. So basically water and hygiene items, and we should identify the weak point of the supply chains. Maybe it can be production, maybe it can be transport, maybe it can be the problem of the safety measures at the retailer. So you should analyze the whole supply chain, not only the local one, but maybe going further in the regional if products are imported, and find a weak point and try to address this weak point through various support modalities, so cash grants, advocacy, help for logistic, etc. So helping those actors to actually deliver what is required. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Dana, anything to add on your side?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to reflect a bit on the feasibility of cash in these times, because sometimes if people are blocked at home, as we saw from some of the questions we received, they cannot move around, they cannot even go to shops, or the shops are closed, then maybe cash is not such a good idea. I mean, it remains to be discussed, but usually we know that people can move to a certain extent, and in those cases I think it's very important to consider markets and how we can support them. And yes, consider that because of the crisis, some of the supply chains have actually been modified. Yeah, what used to be the norm before COVID is not possible anymore. For instance, if the items are imported, they perhaps cannot be imported anymore, and then we need to look to solutions from internal production. The question is, of course, whether the internal production is sufficient and so on, and how it can be boosted very quickly to respond to the growing needs. So just a few thoughts, I think a bit random, because I was typing an answer to a question when you asked the question.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. And over Elizabeth and Roelof, would you like to add?
So I would just add to that during any kind of emergency crisis along these lines, where it's not just the displaced population that's of concern, it's the entire country and at this point the entire globe. What international actors, organizations, and UN should be doing is looking to support the government so that the government can best support its own citizenry. And I think that although WASH is uniquely a municipal and local issue and service, it has both a national and a local response that can be supported through those governmental entities. And so I think that it really has been a best practice to see how some of these organizations have moved to support the government in the government's response in this. And I think that that's a good best practice to look in the future.
Great, thank you. And finally, maybe from Parvin, last word.
Yeah, I think one of the questions we need to ask ourselves at the beginning is, why not cash? Why not local markets? You know, just as a way of checking ourselves as we design our programs, you know, so that we don't look externally, but we look internally as a fast response. And also just clarifying that when we talk about market actors are not just about the private sector. You know, some of you are talking about utilities, some of you are talking about government, some of you are talking about different sort of public institutions, including ourselves as NGOs. We are part of the market, that we need to consider how all these players come together to support the delivery of programs. But because we are emphasizing the resilience element of it, we need, somebody has just put a question, when we leave, when we as NGOs leave, who do we leave on the ground, and how situated are they to be able to respond to future crises? We want to leave them better, not worse.
Great, thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Lynn to close.
Great, thank you all for all the presenters and all the participants today for sharing your experiences. And thank you for, I think, your wise words to look at some sustainable options as we're entering this crisis for certainly the medium term. We just launched a quick poll just to see if you're interested in attending more webinars. And also we wanted to highlight that this webinar will also be delivered in Spanish, French, and Arabic. So this will be for the next 3 weeks on Thursday. So please do share with your colleagues of different linguistic backgrounds. We want to make sure that this gets to local actors and to field actors who are on the front lines responding, possibly the virtual front lines as well. And if you have any ideas for future topics, we look forward to continuing the collaboration with the Global WASH Cluster and with ProWASH on seeing how we can grow in this area, because there's certainly a lot to delve into, and today we've only scratched the surface. So thank you again, and please do stay tuned. There will be the recording and the PowerPoint shared, and please do keep in touch. Okay, take care everyone, and have a good week.